I recently picked up the Sony FE 2.8 macro lens, and I wanted to make a video about it and really focus on video aspects when using this lens. I noticed that a lot of people have great videos, but in regards to photography, and I want to kind of give you guys a review in respect to being a videographer and using it for videos. Let's dive in. So the first thing that I did want to talk about is this is probably Sony's standard for macro lenses, and honestly the standard for the industry. I remember when this first came out, a lot of other companies, other brands really took notice because Sony did it so well. I highly recommend that you buy this used. I think brand new it hovers around 900 or $1,000, something like that. And I think it's a G lens, not a G Master. Yeah, it's a G lens. So it's not top tier. It's designed to be affordable and really give you the best bang for your buck. But if you get it used like I did, and I believe I bought this for about $650 used online, it's an exceptional value. And this one was barely used. The person that sold it to me told me that he bought it thinking he was going to need it for macro photography. Ended up being a phase. He didn't really use it as much as he thought he would, and then put it away for years. And when I got it, it is in beautiful, beautiful condition. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. So it was definitely a score. I did also want to say that I think this lens came out about 4 or 5 years ago from Sony. So even though it's the standard, or was the standard, and now everyone's trying to mimic or replicate the quality and the sharpness that you get out of this lens, it's pretty old. It has old autofocus technology. So it's definitely dated, and that's kind of why I say that it's probably best to buy it used. So at the time of making this video, I have no clue if there's a new version of this lens or version 2 that's coming out, and if you end up buying this lens because of this video and then a new one comes out, I apologize, but I suspect that Sony's probably working on a version 2. Let's start off with the build quality. Build quality is okay. It's a G lens. I haven't had any issues. I would not drop this lens though, and I think it doesn't really have very good weather sealing. Yep, weather sealing is going to be a bit lacking. I wouldn't be caught out in the rain with this lens, but it has solid build construction. I feel like it's pretty good in the hands. I've seen some horror stories online where the mounting point where it mounts on snaps off, or somebody drops this lens and it completely shatters, and they have to send it in for repair, and it never works the same again. So I would say, be gentle, be mindful that it's not a G Master, and in general you should be mindful with your lenses. Take care of it, and if you take care of it, it'll take care of you. So overall build quality is okay. Some of the features that you get is this really great lens hood, which I use all the time. I love this lens barrel that they give you. You have all of your distances for macro photography or videography. For manual focus, I highly recommend that you learn these distances because they will come in handy, and the autofocus on this lens is okay. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It has this very unique design where you go from manual to autofocus by lifting up. So going up, you're in autofocus mode. Going down, you're now in manual focus mode, and then you just adjust as needed. And then on the side here, you're going to find a button. This is a function button that you can assign to whatever you want to assign it to in the camera. You'll find your steady shot or optical steady shot, which is image stabilization. You do get lens stabilization with this macro lens, which is fantastic and was unheard of before. It can be a flaw, so I would say 90% of the time I have it on. There is a very specific scenario where I turn it off, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then you have your autofocus toggle, right, or focusing toggle. Because this is a macro lens, it tends to hunt if you're not telling it where to look specifically. So all the way towards the camera, you have from 0.5 meters to 0.28 meters. In the middle will give you infinity to 0.5 meters. And then all the way to the left, my left, or away from the camera, you'll have full So if you want to go to the full spectrum of your macro photography or videography, you would go to full, and then the lens will hunt a lot more, especially if you're not using it in macro mode. Or you can refine it, go to infinity to 0.5, or if you're doing, portrait photography, or you're using it as an actual 90mm lens, then you can refine it further, and then the lens will know what you're trying to do. So now let's talk about autofocusing. Autofocusing is okay. It's not the absolute best, but it's not the absolute worst. I think the majority of the time you're going to be using it in manual mode, and I also think it's going to rely heavily on the light conditions that you're in. So I noticed that when I'm out in sunlight, in daylight, and there's plenty of light out there, I have been pretty happy with the autofocus. It's been pretty good. But then when we get into low light or darker, moodier, cinematic lighting, then I notice that the autofocus tends to hunt, and it does this weird thing where it's stepping, and you can kind of see it in the video, and it has ruined shots for me before. So here's the thing. Most of the time, I think you're going to be in manual mode, manual focus, especially if you're doing photography. But for videography, which this video is about, doesn't work out that great. So something that I like to do with this lens, and to be honest, I bought this lens mainly for product videos, because I noticed on social media especially, people are really into, brands are really into now, really close macro video work where you're really showcasing the details of the product. And you can only do that with either a probe lens or macro lenses, and this 90mm macro lens is fantastic. Unless I add a gear on here to kind of help me with the manual focusing, it's almost impossible. So I have to rely on autofocusing. And with the 2.8 aperture, which is fantastic, right? Gives you that bokeh, that creamy, blurry background, and lets in a lot more light. Things get trickier with autofocusing. You can get around it by just making sure that you light your scene a lot better. I like to put this on a slider and use the slider to get repeatable shots for our videos. And we've used this on a lot of product videos, and it worked out fantastic. Here's some lessons learned. When you are in autofocus mode, sometimes, especially when you are already stabilized on a tripod or maybe a slider, you don't always need the optical steady shot. Now, definitely do a test run. You should do a test run anyways, right? Try to get familiar with this lens ahead of time. I think you need to for the autofocus and to figure out what its quirks are. But if you turn this off, the steady shot, and sometimes you even have to turn off the image stabilization, in-body image stabilization on your camera, it tends to then work a lot better, and it doesn't do that weird stepping thing where it's autofocusing, but it's stepping and it's very clear. You can also fix the stepping issue. Like, let's say it does happen and you realize later, and you can't really see it on screen, right? It's something that you kind of realize when you review later on. Oh no, it's doing the stepping focus. Holy crap, what can I do? You can actually get rid of it in post-production. I use Final Cut Pro, and I'll just toggle on the stabilization function, dial it down. Usually I don't have to use very much of it, and it will actually clean out that stepping look. So, make sure you're familiar with it, but you don't need the lens stabilization, and sometimes you don't even need the in-body stabilization if you're already stabilizing on a slider or a gimbal or whatever. It tends to give this weird stepping look with the autofocus. 2.8 f2.8 is fantastic, and that's in a lot of light, but it definitely does make this lens kind of start to hunt a lot because things are blurry now and I can't figure out what's going on exactly. So make sure you use the toggle it. You don't need to be on full every single time. If you know the distance that you're going to be at and you know the range that you're going to be moving into, then just make it easier on the lens. Toggle it, and that way it knows kind of what you're doing and will stay within that lens. Tracking has been pretty good with this lens, but if there's not a whole lot of light, it loses the subject almost immediately. So a lot of lighting, definitely invest in your lighting, but making sure that your subject is fully exposed will help this lens just do magic. And then the next thing is 2.8 is great, but if you're doing a lot of green screen work and blue screen work, and in general, if you're doing a lot of FX work, right, then 2.8 isn't great. I'll show you an example here. We're doing a video on a Arizona green tea can, and I think our f-stop was something like 5.6 or something like that. You can see that it's choppy. The edges are choppy for the blue screen work, and that's because it's blurry. We needed to go a lot higher. I noticed that when you're doing blue screen work, you're going to go to f7.1. You're going to go, a lot more in focus. You're going to want less of that blurriness because you need to make sure you have that crisp line for the product to be masked out later. That also affects lighting, right? The lens is going, if you don't have enough lights, if you don't have enough of exposure, it's going to have a very hard time finding the subject. So again, really make sure you've invested in lights for macro videography. Now, if you're outside, or if you're going handheld or something like that, and you're taking a video of a bug or a flower or whatever, then yeah, of course, the in-body image stabilization on a Sony camera along with the lens is going to give you the best shot possible on getting the image or the video that you want. But I still think you'll be better off on a tripod, obviously. And in that case, you may or may not need it. Toggle it, but I found that when you're outdoors and direct sunlight, it works a lot better, but just get familiar with your lens. Let's talk about image quality. This has one of the best image qualities out of a lens. I'm actually kind of surprised how good it is at the value that you get, the price that you're paying, and especially if you get it used. The colors are beautiful. The image is extremely flattering. If you go to f2.8, bokeh looks fantastic. The 90mm focal length is very usable. This takes a diameter of 62 for your ND filters and all that good stuff. It's just a great image. It looks great. It looks cinematic. And then when you get those macro videos in, I've never had a client go, oh, I really don't like what I'm seeing. It's really, really fantastic. And I can see why it's the standard for macro photography, or was the standard for macro photography and videography. I have no complaints with image. Even in low light, even in cinematic mood lighting, the colors all looked good. It all looked flattering. There was no distortion. There was nothing that made me feel like I had to do a lot of work in post, right? It just looks good. And that's kind of what you want. Macro videography, macro work in general is a little stressful because now you're playing in a different sandbox. So you don't want to have to worry about these things, right? You want the autofocus to just kind of work. You want the colors to look right. You want it to be repeatable, and you want it to be flattering. So let's talk about bokeh. f2.8 is a huge selling point, and I know a lot of you are going to, really care about that. Bokeh balls, or bokeh in general, I'm not really a big bokeh nerd. I found it to be flattering enough. Some of you may be like very religious about the bokeh balls and the spheres and how they look. They're not completely round, right? They don't look as flattering as maybe another lens that you're used to, like a 85 1.2 or something. But bokeh to me was great. It satisfied my itch, and the f2.8 looks great as well. You do get this very portrait look when you're like taking a video of a person, a subject, when you're using it in portrait work rather than macro work. It looks fantastic. I think, would I use this lens dedicated for portrait photography or videography? Probably not. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people would be a lot happier with a 85mm 1.2, for example, or whatever. But, it's extremely versatile. It can do it, and it does it very, very well. So bokeh has been very flattering. So daylight versus nighttime is a big deal, big difference. Here's some shots that I did in daytime where I'm just walking around the garden, taking some macro videos of bugs or flowers or things like that. I really want you guys to focus on the colors. I want you to focus on the detail. I want you to focus on the sharpness. It looks great. We're paired this again with the Sony A7S3, which is a 4K video beast. No complaints, right? We have an ND filter on here. I think it's doing a fantastic job. Now here's some shots of it in low light, nighttime. It's Halloween right now, so we're taking videos of just random Halloween things around the house. We have some pumpkins, we have some lights, we have some decorations and monsters and things like that. And you can see that, again, it's very flattering. It looks really cool. When we get tight on the macro work, on the macro videos, again, there is a lot of detail. There's a lot of sharpness. You know, I'm toggling between 2.8, I'm going to 5.6, and I'm showing you guys that as long as you have good light, you can get great work out of this lens. How would I summarize the Sony FE 2.8 90 Macro GOSS lens? I think it's a tremendous value. I do think it's a bit dated. I think if Sony were to upgrade this lens and give us a version 2, they'd probably, for sure, upgrade the image stabilization, and they would probably upgrade the autofocus with something that's a little bit more quiet, because it's kind of noisy. Not a lot, never got picked up in the camera, but something that's a little bit quieter and a little bit more repeatable, a little bit more linear. And then I also think that I would expect Sony to also probably fix the bokeh balls and just give you guys everything that you're asking for. Overall, this is fantastic. It's a great versatile lens, great value. I can see why it's so standard. Definitely get it used. I also want to mention one more thing in my final thoughts. I also have the Canon RF 100mm macro lens. So Canon kind of went one up against Sony and went with the 100, and that one's also an f2.8. I'll be doing a review on that lens shortly, so look for that real soon. Again, it's going to be from a videographer, video perspective. But I can tell you that because the RF system is just a newer system in general, the Canon RF definitely has a little bit more of an advantage over the Sony, and that's mainly because it's just updated. It's more of a modern lens with modern features and things like that. I'm really happy with the RF version. I do see a difference, not a huge difference, but there is more of a difference, especially with autofocusing. That's it for me, guys. I hope you found this video informative, and if you did, please consider subscribing and joining our channel membership so we can continue making videos like this one. I'll catch you in the next video. Take care, everybody.